Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about idealized proportion of the human figure. It's very handy knowledge when drawing the human figure to have a good understanding of idealized proportion. For centuries, basically, artists have used the human skeleton as the underlying structure for idealized proportion because it's always better to use bony landmarks as opposed to fleshy landmarks. Fleshy landmarks I see currently with some books and whatnot where they mention proportion and they'll use fleshy landmarks, but depending on the age, the character, the weight, and so forth of the human figure, fleshy landmarks can always change. So it's always best to use bony landmarks. So that's why the skeleton is so helpful in that capacity. For centuries, basically what most artists have used what is known as an 8-head scale. So they take the size of the head, the length from here to here, and they'll use this going down. So we have, that's one head. This would be 2 heads, 3 heads, 4 heads, and then the bottom would be 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that is how we come about the concept of the 8-head scale. Breaking it down real simple, one of the things that's very helpful to do when you're drawing a human figure is to think from the top portion here of the head to this point of the pelvis, okay? This would be the halfway point. So just above the pubic symphysis, where the head of the femur is and the great trochanter, that is approximately the halfway point. If you always use this, it'll be very helpful to you. So think this is the top half, this section here is the bottom half. When drawing the legs, it's very simple because if you think the midsection between the femur and the tibia, that is basically is the halfway point. So if you make your upper leg a certain length, just make the lower leg the exact same length and you'll be in pretty good shape. We'll go over a few things here that are helpful to keep in mind. So most people, when they draw the human figure, the first head will come down here. The next head will be right here about where the end of the xiphoid process is on the rib cage. So if you see this little mark for the opening of the rib cage, then that's pretty much where you know where your second head is. So then this would be the halfway point from here. So if you do this top portion this length, just make the second portion this length. And then we talked again already about the legs, the knees being the halfway point. So when you get to the arms, and this is especially with beginners, people have a tendency to always make the arms too short and the legs too short. My recommendation for everybody is when you're first learning to draw the human figure, and ultimately as you get better and better at it, it's always best to have the arms slightly too long as opposed to too short. When you're drawing the legs, it's always better to have them slightly longer than too short. If you're doing fantasy art and fantasy creatures and maybe you're drawing a dwarf or something of that nature, that's where you start altering the proportions to do fantasy work. But for traditional figure drawing, if you stick to the 8-head scale, you want to, if you're going to be wrong with the arms, be wrong having them too long as opposed to too short. If you'll notice here, obviously this bends down just a little bit, but basically your elbow right here will hit your pelvis. So many times I'll see people draw the human figure and they have the hand up here. You have the upper arm, the lower arm, the hand, all before they get to the pelvis. The reality is your fingers, especially your long finger here, it reaches almost nearly to your patella. If I'm standing here, it comes way down here. It extends much further down. So always have your arms slightly longer. Hands are basically the size of your face. So if we were to come here, your chin right here, this part goes, if you put this on your chin, your fingertips will come somewhere near your hairline on most people. There's always exceptions. Some people's hairline is a little higher. But generally speaking, if you get this portion of your hand and put that on your chin and go up, you'll see that it'll come right almost to your hairline in most people. If you're going to be wrong with drawing your hands, always make your hands too large. If it's a male, it's more powerful. If it's a female and the female has long fingers, it's more graceful and elegant. So it always looks funny if hands are done too small. Same with the feet. If you're going to be wrong when you're drawing the feet, it's better to make your feet too large as opposed to too small. The head is different. If you're doing something that's more heroic or graceful, if you're going to be wrong when you're drawing the human head, it's always better to draw the head slightly smaller. All right, if you're doing a dwarf, the head would be very big in comparison to the body. When you're drawing a dwarf, and we'll do a little drawing demonstration a little bit later on, where we'll talk about some fantasy things, but the head of a dwarf is basically the whole body is 4 head lengths as opposed to 8. So when you're drawing this, if you're going to do like Michelangelo's David, the head is actually would be almost 10 head lengths would be the body. Its head's smaller in comparison to the size of the body. And that makes it more heroic and more powerful. People that do creature design and do superheroes and things of that nature will frequently do 10, 12, or even 14 heads the size of the figure. So the head will be very tiny in comparison to the overall size of the body. So arms, remember that your elbow comes down near your pelvis, okay? Your upper arm should fall almost to your pelvis. The lower arm falls below. The hand gets very close down to where your patella is, the kneecap. If you bend the arm, you can pretty much make the upper arm and the lower arm, the same length. The lower arm might be slightly shorter, but if you make it the same, it would still look proper. It would still look appropriate. So the distance from here to here is basically the distance from here to here. Then you add the hand and whatever the size of the head is, unless you've intentionally made the head smaller, but then you would make the hands bigger, all right? So the upper leg is basically the halfway point of the lower leg. So when you're adding your legs, get this halfway point in. Feet, if you're going to be wrong, make the feet too big as opposed to too small. It has to be able to carry the weight of the individual when they're walking. So that kind of covers that. It's 8 heads in length, and I've got another here, little skull here. The other thing that's helpful to think of is, so we have our head here. Basically, the rib cage is 2 heads wide. All right, the pelvis has the same width. If you look back at some of your drawings that you've done earlier, you may notice that you've made the rib cage really wide and boxy. The pelvis may have been too small, or you may have done the reverse. You may have had some of the drawings where the pelvis was really big, the rib cage was really small. If you look back, you may notice that some of your drawings, the legs were really short and the arms were really short. So I'm hoping that getting a little bit of this understanding of idealized proportion will be very helpful to you to make your figure start to look more realistic. And as we move in now in the next few weeks into drawing, start adding the muscles to the bone structure and whatnot, understanding those proportions I think will also be very beneficial. So again, the width of the rib cage is basically 2 heads. The width of the pelvis is basically 2 heads. And as you can see here now, we'll go down real quickly. So this is 1 head. This would be 2 heads. Okay, and right here, that's 3 heads. And then we come down here, that makes this 4 heads. And then we've got another head here, another head here, a head here, and a head here. And so you can see that the figure is basically 8 heads in height. I believe that will make things much easier for you guys. And it should help to draw the human figure. I hope that you find that very beneficial.